Laura Carter walked out of the Alpha 9 Intergalactic Medical Center for the last time, her hands gripping a small bag filled with personal belongings. The doors slid shut behind her with a cold hiss, as if sealing her fate. Just a few hours ago, she had been one of the top human nurses in the facility, but now she was nothing, fired, blacklisted, and cast out like a discarded tool. The reason for her dismissal was simple. She had refused to comply with an unethical order. An influential alien senator had demanded that his treatment be prioritized over a critically injured laborer from the lower districts. Laura had refused, choosing to save the laborer instead. The hospital administration had not taken kindly to her defiance. Now, as she walked through the neon-lit streets of Alpha 9's space colony, the weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulder. Laura had no plan. Her access to the medical network had been revoked, meaning she couldn't apply for another job in any of the colony's clinics. Her credits were running low, and without employment, she had no way to afford rent for more than a few weeks. The thought of leaving Alpha 9 and returning to human-controlled space crossed her mind, but the cost of a ticket off-world was astronomical. Her feet carried her toward the industrial district, where the glowing advertisements and crowded markets of the central hub faded into dimly lit alleyways and towering warehouses. The air was heavy with the scent of metal, fuel, and something acrid that she couldn't quite place. She had no destination, just the desperate need to move, to put distance between herself and the hospital that had betrayed her. Then she heard it. A low, ragged exhale, followed by a wet, rattling breath. Laura stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. The sound came from the shadows between two massive storage units, where flickering light barely reached. She took a cautious step forward, her medical instincts overriding her sense of self-preservation. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Another strained breath, then a weak growl. Laura's heart pounded as she pulled out a small portable scanner from her bag, one of the few medical tools she still had. She inched closer, scanning the darkness until she saw it. A massive, scaled form lay curled in the shadows, its body barely rising and falling with each labored breath. Its deep violet scales shimmered faintly under the neon glow of distant streetlights, but many were cracked or missing, revealing raw, torn flesh beneath. A pair of enormous wings, once majestic, now lay in tatters, membranes shredded and dripping dark blood onto the grimy pavement. Laura's breath caught in her throat. It was a Draven, a dragon-like species that rarely interacted with humans outside of official diplomatic affairs. She had seen holovids of them before, towering creatures with golden eyes and an aura of ancient power. But this one was dying. A fresh wave of pained breathing shook the creature's body, and Laura acted on instinct. She dropped to her knees beside him, pushing away her fear. Her scanner beeped rapidly, feeding her a stream of distressing data: severe internal bleeding, multiple fractures, and extensive tissue damage. He was on the verge of cardiac failure. "Hey, stay with me," she murmured, unsure if he could understand her. Golden eyes flickered open, locking onto her. Laura's fingers trembled as she reached into her bag, pulling out a vial of high-concentration regen serum. It wasn't designed for Dravians, but it was all she had. She hesitated, knowing that injecting an unknown species with human medicine could be dangerous. But if she did nothing, he would die. "Please don't kill you," she muttered under her breath, then pressed the vial against his side and injected the serum. The reaction was immediate. His body tensed, muscles seizing as the serum worked through his system. His claws scraped against the ground, and his chest expanded in a deep, ragged inhale. Then, to her shock, his voice, raspy but unmistakably sentient, whispered, "Why? Help!" Laura froze. She had assumed he was unconscious. Now, faced with his piercing gaze, she struggled to find an answer. "Because you're hurt," she finally said. "And I don't let people die if I can stop it." A slow, almost unreadable expression passed over his face, something between disbelief and gratitude. His breathing steadied, but his injuries were still severe. "I need to get you somewhere safe," she said, looking around. She was still exposed in the open, and if someone saw a human tending to a Draven, questions would be asked. Laura glanced at the alley's exit. If she could get him to her apartment, she could stabilize his condition properly, but moving him in this state would be risky. As if sensing her hesitation, the Draven exhaled sharply and muttered, "Dangerous for you." Laura snorted. "I just got fired, blacklisted, and thrown out of my job for doing the right thing? My life's already a mess. What's one more risk?" For the first time, something resembling a smile ghosted across his scaled face. "Foolish, human," he murmured. Yeah, you're not the first to say that." She looped his arm over her shoulder, adjusting to his surprising weight. He was weak but still strong enough to move with some assistance. Slowly, she helped him to his feet. With great effort, Laura guided him through the back streets, avoiding main roads and security cameras. Every step was agonizingly slow, but she refused to stop. She didn't know why she was doing this, why she was risking everything for a creature she didn't even know. But deep down, she felt it. Something bigger was happening. And she had just stepped right into the middle of it. Laura pushed open the door to her tiny apartment, her muscles aching from the strain of supporting the massive Draven's weight. Zyen, at least that was what he had managed to rasp out during their slow, painful journey, half collapsed as she guided him toward the floor mattress in the corner of the room. He was too large to fit on the actual bed, and she had no other choice. As soon as he was settled, she rushed to her makeshift medical station, yanking open drawers and rummaging through her supplies. The apartment was small, barely more than a single room with a kitchenette and a narrow bathroom, but at least it was private. Outside, the neon lights of Alpha 9 flickered through the blinds, casting jagged blue and purple patterns across Zyen's blood-stained scales. Laura grabbed an antiseptic foam, a roll of bio-gauze, and her last vial of cellular accelerator serum. She had used the regen serum back in the alley, but it was only a temporary stabilizer. If she didn't treat the deeper injuries soon, his body would shut down before dawn. She knelt beside him, peeling back the remnants of his torn flight suit to expose the worst of his wounds. Deep lacerations ran across his torso, some exposing layers of muscle beneath. The wings were even worse, shredded almost beyond recognition. She winced. Flying would be out of the question for a long time. Zyen stirred, his golden eyes flickering open as she pressed the antiseptic foam against his side. His entire body tensed, his claws scraping against the floor. A sharp growl rumbled in his chest, but he didn't strike at her. "Yeah, I know it burns," Laura muttered. "You're lucky I don't have anything stronger. If I had access to a proper medical lab, this would be a lot easier," he grunted, the sound more exhaustion than agreement. His breathing was still uneven, but at least he was conscious. She worked quickly, coating the wounds with the antiseptic before applying the bio-gauze, watching as it adhered to his skin and hardened into a protective seal. The serum would help accelerate cell regeneration, but Draven biology was different from human biology. She had no way of knowing if it would actually work or make things worse. His eyes followed her hands as she applied the last of the gauze. "You are not afraid," Laura exhaled, sitting back on her heels. "Of what?" A ghost of a smirk crossed his face. Most humans would be. She leaned against the edge of her bed, rubbing the back of her neck. "I've treated a lot of different species. Once you've had to stitch up a 6-armed mercenary with acid for blood, a big dragon isn't that intimidating." His smirk faded as he studied her. "Not just me. You are not afraid of the consequences." Laura hesitated. She knew what he meant. She had risked everything just by bringing him here. If anyone found out, she could be arrested. The Dravians were a powerful species, but they were also secretive. If Zyen was important, then there were people out there looking for him, people who might not care whether she had saved him or not. But she had made her choice. There was no going back now. "Fear doesn't change anything," she finally said. "If I let someone die when I could have helped, I'd regret it more than anything that happens after." Zyen was silent for a moment. Then he closed his eyes, his body relaxing slightly. Then, I owe you a debt. Laura let out a dry laugh. Great. Add it to my list of problems. She stood, stretching her stiff limbs. The adrenaline from earlier had worn off, leaving her body aching and her mind sluggish. She hadn't eaten since before she was fired, and exhaustion gnawed at her, but there was no way she was sleeping yet. Not with an injured Draven taking up half her floor. She moved to the kitchenette, rummaging through her cabinets. She had a few protein rations left, but nothing substantial. She glanced back at Zyen. Did Dravens even eat human food? Are you hungry? She asked. His eyes cracked open again, watching her with that unreadable intensity. Food can wait, right? Because you've got so much energy left, she muttered, pulling out a nutrient pack anyway. She sat on the edge of her bed, tearing open the packet and taking a small bite. The bland, paste-like substance was about as appetizing as wet cardboard, but it would keep her going. Zyen watched her in silence, his breathing steadier now. He didn't speak again, but she could tell he was still awake. His eyes would drift shut for a few moments, only to flicker open again, as if he was forcing himself to stay alert. Laura sighed, setting her food aside. You should sleep. His gaze met hers. Neither of us should, she frowned. Why? His jaw tightened slightly before he finally answered. Because they will come. A chill ran down her spine. Who? He closed his eyes again, his voice barely above a whisper. The ones who tried to kill me. Laura's grip tightened on the empty ration packet. She had expected danger, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. She looked toward the door, her mind already racing. If someone had wanted Zyen dead badly enough to leave him for dead in an alley, then they wouldn't just hope he had died. They would be looking for him, and if they found him here, Laura exhaled slowly. I really should have walked away. But she hadn't. And now, whether she liked it or not, she was part of this. Laura's eyes snapped open at the low hum of approaching engines. She had dozed off against her better judgment, her body giving in to exhaustion despite the warning that danger was near. Now, as she forced herself upright, the room was bathed in an eerie blue glow. She turned toward the window. Outside, the sky above Alpha 9 pulsed with shifting lights, and the source of the illumination became chillingly clear. Hovering just beyond the outskirts of the district, 4 enormous starships cast their sleek, metallic silhouettes against the dark sky. The polished hulls gleamed under the artificial neon glow of the colony, their presence so commanding that even the distant streets seemed to fall silent in reverence. Her stomach twisted. She had expected trouble, but this was something else entirely. A ragged exhale from behind her made her turn. Zyen had propped himself up, golden eyes locked on the scene outside. His expression, though calm, carried a heavy weight. They found me faster than I expected, he muttered. His voice was stronger now, though still edged with exhaustion. Laura clenched her fists. You knew this was coming? Yes, he admitted, his gaze still fixed on the ships. But not this soon. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the metal. No footsteps yet. No alarms. That meant whoever was on board those ships hadn't landed, or worse, hadn't decided to announce their presence before making a move. You recognize them? She asked, her pulse thrumming in her ears. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes, those are Royal Fleet vessels. Laura turned sharply. Royal? As in your people's government? Zyen nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. Only high-ranking Dravens have access to ships of this class, and only for matters of great importance. Her stomach dropped. So they know you're alive. A slow, deliberate blink. And now, so do you. Laura exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through her hair. She hadn't thought much about the implications of saving him beyond the immediate danger, but now it was clear. She hadn't just helped some random fugitive. She had intervened in something massive, something political. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Were they here to retrieve him? To kill him? To kill her for interfering? Then the apartment's security pad beeped. Laura's blood ran cold. The only way that pad would activate was if someone had manually accessed the exterior console. Someone was at the door. Zyen shifted, his claws pressing into the floor, but Laura shot him a glare. "Don't even think about getting up," she whispered. "You're still injured, and I don't need you collapsing in the middle of whatever's about to happen." He smirked slightly. "You're ordering royalty now?" She ignored him, creeping toward the door. Her fingers hovered over the panel. Whoever was outside hadn't forced entry yet, which meant they wanted something from her first. Taking a slow breath, she pressed the intercom button. "Who is it?" For a moment there was silence. Then a voice. Smooth, precise, and entirely too calm. "Miss Carter," the stranger said, "you have something that belongs to the Draven Empire. Open the door." Laura's pulse pounded. The voice carried authority, but not aggression. That was somehow more unnerving. She glanced at Zyen, whose expression had hardened. He knew the voice. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Someone I had hoped never to see again," he murmured. The intercom crackled again. "You have exactly 10 seconds to comply before we enter by force." Laura did not like the sound of that. She pressed the button again. "You show up in a fleet of luxury warships, track me down in the middle of the night, and expect me to just open the door without an explanation?" A soft chuckle from the other side. "You misunderstand. This is not a request. It is a courtesy." Then the locks disengaged. Laura barely had time to react before the door slid open, revealing 3 figures standing in the corridor. The one in the center stepped forward first. He was tall, taller than Zyen even in his weakened state, and carried himself with a sharp, almost regal posture. His dark crimson scales gleamed under the dim corridor lighting, and his golden eyes held the same piercing quality as Zyen's, but colder, more calculating. He wore a high-collared military uniform lined with intricate gold embroidery, a curved ceremonial blade strapped to his hip. His presence commanded attention and authority. Laura had seen enough diplomats and high-ranking officials in her time at the medical center to know this was someone important. His gaze swept over her once before shifting to the figure on the floor. "Zyen," he said smoothly. "Still alive, I see." Zyen exhaled slowly. "Disappointed?" The stranger's lips curled into something that might have been amusement. "Not at all. Though I am curious as to how you managed it." Laura tensed as those golden eyes turned to her. "And this must be the human responsible." She crossed her arms. "Yeah, that would be me." For a moment he studied her. Then, without breaking eye contact, he spoke again, this time to Zyen. "Explain." Laura blinked. "Excuse me?" Zyen sighed, shifting slightly against the mattress. "She saved my life. That should be enough explanation." "It is not," the stranger countered. "A human nurse, recently dismissed from her station, just so happens to find you near death and takes you in out of sheer goodwill?" He tilted his head slightly. "Either you are astonishingly lucky, or there is more to this than coincidence." Laura clenched her jaw. "If I were part of some big conspiracy, do you really think I'd be living in a one-room apartment on the outskirts of Alpha 9? The stranger's expression remained unreadable, but she caught a flicker of amusement behind his eyes. "Perhaps not. But intentions matter little now. What does matter is that you have interfered in affairs far beyond your understanding." Laura exhaled sharply. "Right, and what exactly are those affairs?" For the first time, the stranger's expression shifted, just slightly. Zyen, however, answered before he could. "The throne," he said simply. Laura felt the room tilt slightly. "I'm sorry, the what?" The stranger's gaze darkened. Zyen should have died that night. His survival changes everything. She turned to Zyen, who looked disturbingly calm. "Are you telling me you're some kind of Draven prince?" Zyen held her gaze for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "Crown heir." Laura slowly turned back to the stranger. "And you?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "His older brother." Her mind reeled. She had known Zyen was important, but this was so much worse, and she was in the middle of it. The stranger's expression cooled. "You now have a choice, human." Laura tensed. "You can walk away. Forget this ever happened. Take whatever sum you desire, and your life will remain untouched." His voice dropped lower, though the weight behind it intensified. "Or you can involve yourself further and face the consequences." Zyen shifted beside her, watching her carefully. He wasn't saying anything. He was letting her decide. Laura's heart pounded. She already knew her answer. Laura's fingers curled into fists at her sides. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. But the answer had been obvious from the moment she had dragged Zyen into her apartment. She wasn't the kind of person who walked away from someone in need, not when she could help, not when she had already risked everything to save him. She lifted her chin and met the older Dravian's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." A flicker of something passed through his golden eyes. Amusement? Annoyance? It was impossible to tell. He exhaled sharply, then turned away, as if her decision wasn't worth arguing over. "Very well," he said, "then you will come with us." Laura's pulse quickened. "Excuse me?" Zyen's brother didn't bother repeating himself. He motioned to the two armored guards standing behind him. One of them stepped forward, producing a sleek holodivide and tapping at the interface. A deep hum vibrated through the walls, and Laura barely had time to react before the entire room shifted around her. The air seemed to bend, the walls rippling like waves on the surface of a lake. The faint scent of ozone filled her nose, and for a brief, dizzying second, it felt like the floor had vanished beneath her feet. Then, just as quickly as it began, the sensation stopped. Laura stumbled, catching herself against the edge of her bed. The dim, flickering glow of her apartment was gone. The uneven hum of the colony's street traffic had vanished. Instead, the air was filled with a soft, ambient hum. A sound too smooth, too refined to belong to anything but high-gravian technology. She looked up and froze. The apartment was gone. She was standing inside an expansive chamber lined with curved metallic walls that shimmered faintly under a soft golden glow. The architecture was sleek, with intricate patterns carved into the surfaces, patterns that pulsed with a quiet, rhythmic energy. The air was crisp, the temperature perfectly balanced, and the floor beneath her feet wasn't hard metal but a smooth, flexible surface that adjusted slightly with each step. She was on a ship. Her stomach twisted as realization struck. Teleportation. She turned sharply, eyes landing on Zyen. He had collapsed onto what appeared to be a reclining medical platform, a stark contrast to the grimy mattress she had patched him up on earlier. He looked exhausted, but his expression was unreadable. Zyen's brother stood at the head of the room, hands clasped behind his back, looking entirely unsurprised by her reaction. "Welcome aboard the celestial Fang," he said smoothly. Laura forced herself to take a steady breath, focus, adapt, survive. She had worked with alien technology before. She had been stationed at an intergalactic medical center. She had treated patients from over 50 different species. But this, being inside a Dravian royal vessel, was entirely different. She squared her shoulders and narrowed her eyes at Zyen's brother. "You didn't tell me you were kidnapping me." He tilted his head slightly. "You made your choice. We simply expedited the process." Laura exhaled sharply. "What now?" He stepped forward, his golden eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Now you will listen." Laura didn't like the way he said that, but she held her ground. He gestured toward Zyen. "You saved my brother's life. That alone has altered the course of the Dravian Empire. His survival will not go unnoticed. There are those who will see your actions as an act of interference, and there are those who will see it as an opportunity." Laura frowned. "Interference in what, exactly?" Zyen, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, but steady. "Inheritance." Laura's breath caught. The throne. Zyen's brother didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, he continued, "The Empire stands on the edge of a shift in power. Many assumed that shift had already taken place, that Zyen was dead, and that the succession would proceed without him." His gaze darkened. "Now that is no longer the case." Laura's stomach twisted. "And I'm guessing that makes me a liability?" Zyen's brother studied her for a long moment. "Not necessarily." She folded her arms. "Then what does it make me?" His expression didn't change. "An asset." Laura wasn't sure if that was better or worse. Zyen exhaled slowly, his voice edged with exhaustion. "She doesn't need to be part of this." His brother shot him a sharp look. "She already is, whether you wish it or not." Laura looked between them, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. Zyen clearly didn't want her involved, but he wasn't in control of this situation. His brother was, and whatever was happening within the Draven Empire, it was bigger than just a power struggle. She clenched her jaw. "If I'm an asset, then what exactly do you want from me?" Zyen's brother smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "For now, nothing." Laura didn't trust that for a second. He stepped closer, his presence commanding, even without aggression. "You are under the protection of this ship. No harm will come to you, so long as you do not invite it upon yourself." Laura narrowed her eyes. "That sounds an awful lot like a threat." He held her gaze. "It is a warning." The air between them felt charged, tense with an unspoken understanding. Then he turned sharply and motioned to one of the guards. "Escort her to the guest quarters. Ensure she is given access to basic amenities but restricted from the bridge." Laura bristled. "So, I'm a prisoner?" "A guest," he corrected smoothly. "Right," she muttered. "A guest who can't leave." He didn't respond. Laura glanced at Zyen. He hadn't moved, but his expression had shifted slightly. Concern. He knew this situation was precarious, and so did she. The guard approached her, motioning toward the exit. Laura had half a mind to fight back, to argue, to demand more answers, but she also knew that picking a fight inside an alien warship probably wasn't the best idea. Instead, she let out a sharp exhale and followed the guard out of the chamber. As the door slid shut behind her, a single thought repeated in her mind. "I should have walked away, but it was far too late for that now." Laura walked through the celestial fang's dimly lit corridor. Her jaw clenched as she followed the silent Draven guard. The sleek metallic walls pulsed with soft golden energy, casting shifting patterns of light along the passage. The entire ship radiated a quiet, controlled power, its very design exuding the same regality that dripped from Zyen's older brother. Her escort never spoke, nor did he glance at her. He moved with the same calculated precision as his leader, a silent enforcer of the authority that now dictated her fate. Laura had no idea where she was being taken, but she knew one thing for certain. She was a prisoner, no matter what they chose to call it. The doors ahead hissed open, revealing what could only be described as a luxury suite in a floating fortress. The room was larger than her entire apartment back on Alpha 9, with sleek furniture sculpted from a polished metal that shimmered faintly in the golden glow of the ceiling's embedded lights. The bed was massive, the floor layered with what appeared to be some kind of woven material that adjusted slightly beneath her steps, and a console embedded in the wall hummed with soft notifications. Laura barely had time to process her surroundings before the doors locked shut behind her. Her stomach twisted. She spun around and slammed a fist against the door panel, but the controls blinked red. "Sealed. Great," she muttered under her breath. "Definitely not a prisoner." She exhaled sharply and turned back to the room. If she was stuck here, she might as well figure out what she was dealing with. She moved to the console, scanning the unfamiliar interface before tapping the screen. The text shifted into Standard Galactic, allowing her to read the options. Meal requests, communication, restricted, entertainment archives. Her lips pressed into a thin line, so she could eat, watch holovids, and stare at a map she wasn't allowed to use. Laura pushed away from the console, frustration bubbling in her chest. She needed a plan. She had no intention of spending the rest of her life locked in a Draven prison, luxury or not. But escape wasn't an option, not yet. Not while she was on a moving starship surrounded by warriors who could crush her with one hand. Her best bet was information. She needed to understand the power struggle she had stumbled into, and there was only one person who might actually give her answers. Zyen. She turned toward the doors again, exhaling sharply. How the hell was she going to get to him? The answer came faster than expected. A soft chime rang through the room. Before Laura could react, the door unlocked. She tensed as it slid open, expecting another guard. Instead, Zyen stepped inside. She stared at him, momentarily caught off guard. He looked different. Stronger. His posture was more upright, his expression calm, yet edged with something unreadable. He wore a high-collared tunic, sleek and lined with golden embroidery. The regal attire suited him far too well. She crossed her arms. "Guessing you're not half dead anymore." A faint smirk touched his lips. "No thanks to your efforts," she huffed. "You're welcome." He studied her for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "You shouldn't be here." She narrowed her eyes. "That wasn't exactly my decision." His gaze flickered, something sharp flashing behind his golden irises. "My brother should not have brought you into this." Laura scoffed. "You mean after you got yourself nearly killed in a back alley?" Zyen's jaw tightened. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way." "Yeah, well, here we are," she shot back. "And now I'm stuck on your fancy ship while your brother decides whether I'm useful enough to keep alive?" A flicker of something passed through his expression. Guilt, maybe. He exhaled. "I didn't want you involved. Then maybe you should have died like you were supposed to," she snapped. Silence. The words had come out harsher than she intended, but she didn't regret them. Zyen was royalty. A prince in a political war she didn't fully understand. His world was one of power, betrayal, and impossible stakes. Hers wasn't. She never should have been part of this. But the moment stretched between them, and to her surprise, Zyen didn't argue. Instead, his voice softened. "I don't regret surviving." Laura swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking into her chest. He stepped closer, his golden eyes locked onto hers. "But I regret that it cost you your freedom." She held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Then help me get it back." Zyen was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "I will." Laura didn't know if she believed him. But before she could say anything, the ship shook. The floor lurched beneath her feet. Alarms blared through the walls. A deep, reverberating impact sent a tremor through the entire vessel. Zyen's expression darkened. "That's an attack." Laura's pulse spiked. "Who the hell is attacking a royal warship?" He didn't answer. His gaze snapped to the console, scanning the emergency readout. His shoulders stiffened. "It's a boarding party. They bypassed the shields." Laura's stomach twisted. "Who?" His jaw clenched. "The ones who tried to kill me before." A second impact rocked the ship. The lights flickered. Distant shouts echoed through the corridors. Weapons fire, the sound of armored boots colliding with metal floors. Zyen turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move." She nodded, adrenaline spiking through her veins. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about both of them. Zyen reached for a panel in the wall, pressing a hidden command. A concealed door slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. Laura didn't hesitate. She stepped inside. Zyen followed. The door sealed behind them. Darkness surrounded them, broken only by the faint glow of emergency lights embedded in the walls. The passage was narrow, just barely large enough for them to move single file. Zyen took the lead, his movements controlled, yet tense. Laura followed closely, her heart pounding. "Where does this lead?" "A secure transport bay," he said. "There's an escape vessel." She swallowed hard. "So we're running?" Zyen's jaw tightened. "No, we're surviving." A distant explosion shook the walls. Laura exhaled sharply. Surviving was good enough for now. They moved. They reached the transport bay just as the alarm screamed in warning. The massive hangar loomed before them, filled with sleek fighter vessels and emergency craft. Security personnel were already engaging the intruders, figures clad in dark combat armor, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. Zyen didn't hesitate. He grabbed Laura's wrist and pulled her toward a sleek, compact starship stationed at the edge of the hangar. The access ramp lowered as they approached, responding to his command. Laura barely had time to process what was happening before they were inside. Zyen sealed the hatch. Engines roared to life. The enemy forces turned, weapons locking onto their vessel, but they were already airborne. The ship shot forward. Laura braced herself as the acceleration slammed her back. The hangar bay doors loomed ahead, closing fast. Zyen pushed the controls to their limits. A heartbeat of silence. Then they were through. The starship pierced the darkness, leaving the battlefield behind. Laura exhaled shakily, her pulse a thunderstorm in her veins. She turned to Zyen. He met her gaze. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had survived. For now.